Suicide research important? Well, I think the statistics really put this in perspective. We know that worldwide, approximately 1.4% of the deaths worldwide can be accounted for by suicide. And when we factor this out by a time frame, this is actually one suicide every 2 seconds. For me, that statistically puts things in a staggering number worldwide for us. Similarly, here in the United States, we do know that this is a legitimate public health concern, with over 38,000 Americans dying by suicide each year and an estimated over 900,000 attempts. You can see I have the picture of Gallagher-Iba Arena on here. Again, to put this in perspective, Gallagher-Iba on a packed out night seats just over 13,000 people. So we see that about 3 times the capacity crowd at Gallagher-Iba will die by suicide each year. Just because of really alarming statistics like this, that researchers have tried to understand why people may actually want to desire suicide. Why would somebody desire this act? They've identified risk factors in the literature in order to help clinicians understand who might be at most risk to be one of those statistics. And the risk factor literature seems to be kind of campy, and there's 2 specific camps that we're noticing. An interpersonal camp, and you've heard a lot about some interpersonal suicide risk factors in the last couple of talks. This includes things like loneliness and boredom, belongingness, which we heard earlier, lack of social support, which we heard from David, as well as maybe somebody's humor style can actually be a risk factor for suicide. But somewhat disparate, though, is this cognitive set of risk factors that don't really get researched in tandem with the interpersonal risk factors that I mentioned earlier. And this can include depressive cognition, such as pessimism or hopelessness, as well as a ruminative cognitive style. As you can tell, my talk's going to be focused on integrating a little bit of the interpersonal and the cognitive, looking at these 2 specific risk factors in tandem and how they may relate to suicide. So if you're like any journal editor I've ever submitted this research to, you're probably wondering why humor and suicide. These things just seem completely opposite. Well, actually, there's some literature demonstrating that a humor style, the way somebody uses humor, may actually be both a risk and a protective factor for suicide. So we know that humor that's used to ease social tensions and generally to be affiliated to try to strengthen social bonds, that this humor style throughout the week can be related to, negatively related to suicidal thinking. So the more often this humor is being used, the less likely somebody is to be experiencing suicidal thinking or symptoms of clinical depression. This makes a little bit of sense when we think of the interpersonal predictors of suicide. This humor style likely creates a social bond and maybe protects people from thoughts of suicide. We also know that people can get lonely even if they use this humor style. So there is some research demonstrating that extreme feelings of loneliness, that relationship or its impact on suicidal ideation is actually weakened or lessened when somebody naturally uses this affiliative humor style. That it may be this humor style is a strong way of coping with loneliness, that somebody can overcome some of those feelings interpersonally by using this humor style. However, you might have heard of the adage that humor is our best medicine. Fortunately, we've actually found that might not always be the case. And humor styles can actually be a risk factor for suicide as well. And the one I'll be specifically talking about today is self-defeating humor. And this is the use of humor that focuses on one's perceived weaknesses or flaws, something we might feel insecure about, and highlighting that in a humorous situation. My favorite example is my penguin friend here. So he is wearing, it's a he, we're pretty close, we watched the game together, and we just got to know each other over the couple of years I've been doing this research. He's wearing that traditional I'm with stupid t-shirt that usually has the arrow pointing towards somebody else. And actually flip the t-shirt this way and he's pointing toward himself. Potential perceived weakness or flaw. But it's humorous, right? He's wearing this t-shirt and it's something that might be using to joke around with other people. But at its core, it's focusing on this weakness that the penguin may be feeling here. So this humor style, we've showed that the increased use of this humor style is related to increased incidence of suicidal thinking, loneliness, and symptoms of depression. And unlike that affiliative humor style that actually weakens that relationship between loneliness and suicidal ideation, the use of this humor style seems to exacerbate it. That people who use this humor style regularly actually seems like makes that impact of loneliness a little bit stronger. With research demonstrating that the self-defeating humor style seems to be very pernicious, it may lead to wondering the question, well, why is somebody likely to use this humor style? What maybe drives this humor use? Well, our lab thought that the reason that might be is one of those cognitive risk factors in the field, and specifically the cognitive risk factor of rumination. And rumination is the constant devotion of one's thinking toward the causes and consequences of distress. Right? You can see a picture in the corner, this person's doing the why, or what if, or no. my best example is that if I came up here and I tripped on my way up, and then I started fumbling around my words and really just tanked this presentation, I'd probably go back to my office, close the door, and sit there going, oh my gosh, what does this mean? Everybody just laughed, they weren't listening to my research. No way I'm gonna get good scores from the judge. I'm gonna sit there and spend way too much time thinking about that. That may be utilizing ruminative cognitive style in that situation. And over a decade of rumination literature has shown that this cognitive style is very strongly predictive of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and even death by suicide. So we know this cognitive style is linked to people who are at risk for suicide. So the current study wanted to address this possible question: is that self-defeating humor style related to ruminative thinking? And we conceptually believe the answer to this question, we hypothesize this would be yes. Again, ruminative style is focusing on this distress, the cause and consequences of it, while a humor style that's self-defeating is potentially focusing on these causes and consequences of something that they're insecure about, somebody's insecure about, but just in an interpersonal sense. And then to expand upon this relationship, we wanted to know, is it possible that that cognitive ruminative style increases the use of self-defeating humor in individuals and thus potentially encourages more suicidal thinking, getting at some sort of potential development trend into suicidal thinking through the interplay of this interpersonal cognitive risk factor. So in order to test these predictions, we recruited 365 participants here at Oklahoma State University, about 2/3 female, pretty young sample, about 19 and a half, and the ethnicity breakdown was predominantly 80% Caucasian, so predominantly white. This is the statistics we normally see when we're convenient sampling the university, especially through our online SONA system. In order to test the variables we were interested in, we utilized self-report measures that were well validated in the field. And it's important to note in this study themselves, these measures demonstrated adequate to strong reliability. I feel like we did a pretty good job of capturing the variables that we wanted to look at. So as far as the results are concerned, I'll orient you to this correlation table first. On the left and right headings, we're seeing our variables, so ST humor, self-defeating humor, rumination, and suicidal ideation. These are just generally looking at the correlations or general association between variables. So replicating research that actually our lab has done, we found that an increased self-defeating humor style was related to increased suicidal ideation in this one-time point sample. We also replicated decades worth of research showing that this increased cognitive style of rumination was also related to increased suicidal thinking. We felt pretty good about our data that we were replicating results that we've already seen in the literature. And of course, maybe what's most novel here is that the increased incidence of the ruminative cognitive style was also related to increased self-defeating. So we saw these general positive correlations between all three study variables. As far as that maybe potential developmental track that we're talking about, how rumination may encourage self-defeating humor and encourage suicidal ideation, we utilize a mediation technique of bootstrapping technique in order to test mediation. And we did find that rumination has an indirect effect on suicidal ideation through increased self-defeating humor. I'll get out of statistics speak and kind of orient you to the table here and talk about it. So as we saw in the correlations, we saw a direct effect with rumination to suicidal ideation. Generally, these things were related to each other at kind of the correlation level. But we also found that rumination was related to suicidal ideation through increased self-defeating humor use, which self-defeating humor use was related to this increase of suicidal ideation, even when controlling for the ruminative cognitive style. So before I move on to any implications, I'll quick go over the results again. We found generally that an increased self-defeating humor use was related to an increased incidence in suicidal ideation in this college sample, and probably most novel, an increased ruminative cognitive style. Similarly, we found that increased rumination was related to increased self-defeating humor, and this increase of self-defeating humor was related to increased suicidal ideation in our sample. We think this research has some, is potentially important as it identifies those who might be most likely to use this humor style, which has been closely linked to depression and suicidal ideation. We believe that this extends our suicide risk assessment of understanding maybe some potential developmental track that we likely want to continue researching, understanding how these thoughts are maintained or potentially developed. Maybe what I think is most interesting, I'm excited to hear what people have to say about this idea is maybe self-defeating humor serves as some sort of interpersonal means of ruminating. So right now in the literature, rumination is fairly considered an intrapersonal variable. Somebody does by themselves, usually mainly an inner monologue. It may be that people who ruminate are really likely to continue ruminating interpersonally through this humor use. This conceptually makes sense, as maybe they want to get more information about their perceived weaknesses and flaws, the things that they're ruminating about, so they're going to tell a joke about this interpersonally and see how people react. So again, I trip, stumble, and I'm really nervous about how things all worked, and I start telling jokes to my friends later on at dinner, like, oh yeah, that was really awful. I mean, it's like I was in 5th grade again, and they go, oh no, it really wasn't that bad. I'm sure the judges understand. You were nervous. Or my friend goes, yeah, you're in trouble there. Maybe it's my way of getting a little bit more information about the causes and consequences of my stress. So I think that might be an interesting suggestion that has important implications for treatment. Specifically in depression and suicide, we often target rumination as a risk factor, as well as something that somebody may do in the moment that can increase suicidal thinking. So traditional therapy techniques, whether that's cognitive or behavioral, have certain therapeutic techniques to help decrease the effect of rumination, decrease the incidence of rumination. Now that we know that potentially this self-defeating humor use may be related to these things, it could be that certain therapeutic interventions could benefit from targeting the intrapersonal rumination, but also maybe replacing or helping somebody identify when they're ruminating through their humor style as well, demonstrating another avenue for targeting that effect in clinical practice. Of course, with any study, there are limitations. I want to make sure I talk about those as you're thinking about study results and how important they may be. This is a limited sample, and generally a convenient sample like this is predominantly female, and it's generally Caucasian females. So we would like to replicate the study results within more ethnically, as well as gender, more of a heterogeneous sample to understand if these results do replicate. Similarly, we like to look at these relationships in a clinical sample. Only one humor style study that I've seen has actually done this, and we found that the correlations generally between these humor styles and depression stay about the same effect. So we're interested to see if that's the case clinically for depression. Is that the case with increased incidence of suicidal ideation? That's an important question that we would need to research. And we're unable to determine causality here. So as I discussed this this kind of trajectory to suicidal ideation, it's important to note that we did look at this at just one time point. But although theoretically it makes sense that a cognitive style may become before increased humor use and thus increasing suicidal ideation, it's important to note that our results can't exactly test that longitudinally. So we are interested in looking at this research longitudinally to look at temporal relationships, as well as we think experimental design would really work in this case, where we can actually have people come in and ruminate in the lab. We feel like we've been able to experimentally do this, and we can take a look at that, maybe putting that person in an interpersonal situation with a friend and seeing if humor use differs between those who have been ruminating and those who haven't. Get at a little bit of the cause and effect here that we can't in this study. I have to give a huge, huge thank you to the Oklahoma State Psychology Department, of course, the co-authors of the manuscript, Victoria O'Keefe, who you heard from earlier, Meredith Slish, David Hollingsworth, Ashley Cole, and of course our faculty advisor, Dr. Wingate, for all of their help on this project. I have to thank two specific undergraduate research assistants, Jessica Help and Corey Lopez. They're very helpful in collecting data and organizing data for this study. They have all moved on to bigger and better things, and I'm proud pop there to see them all out in the field doing great work, but I do need to thank them because I really appreciate their work. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
You know, we've chatted a little bit about how there's not a ton of research on humor styles and suicide.
Yeah.
How do you think, and I don't know if you know anything about humor styles in older individuals who may be at higher risk for suicide, do you think that these findings would generalize to an older sample too? I know the teenagers are much older.
Yeah, generally, this specific humor style is not often correlated with age. So the work in the humor styles literature generally sees the one humor style that seems to change by age, or seems to maybe be influenced, is that of aggressive humor. So the kind of cutting people down in order, in like social situations, that seems to be related to younger individuals. A self-defeating humor style doesn't necessarily seem to potentially follow that trend. So I would presume that the humor style may not be related to any change in age, but we do know that suicidal ideation is higher usually in adults, and attempts are as well. So it would be interesting to see, just judging by the humor styles research out there, I'm not sure humor would change, but maybe results would as we go. Yeah.
You had mentioned that if someone wants to use some possible self-deprecating humor with a friend almost as a way to either make themselves feel better or just to increase on that rumination, the response that they get, whether they sell a self-deprecating joke and they get a lot of laughter, or if they get, oh no, it wasn't that bad, is there any correlation between those and how that's going to play out later on with their suicidal thoughts and their continued rumination?
It's a great question, and it's something that needs to be researched. Unfortunately, very little has looked at rumination humor longitudinally. Look at it mainly cross-sectionally as well as within different samples. So we haven't really, there's some research looking at how couples may use humor, that their humor styles seem to match up. So somebody who uses a lot of aggressive humor is likely to be in a relationship with somebody who uses a lot of aggressive humor. But again, this is mainly at one time point, and it's definitely not looking at how a spouse reacts to humor. And I think that's exactly a really good point, that theory would mention people deploy rumination for a reason. They think that it helps them cope, and it highlights where they can go and try to fix these problems. We find that rumination is related to not active coping, though. People usually don't do this. So the self-defeating humor may be utilized that same way. I'm going to try to get information out of people about how bad these things are, but then when somebody laughs about it, it's like, oh no, I'm actually being validated for what I'm ruminating on. So they may deploy it in a way of potentially feeling better or trying to work on something, but the humor response from the individual, not themselves, may potentially impact that and keep them from coping. It's a great question. If you've got 300 people who want me to follow them around for a while, please let me know. I would love to cope.
Thank you so